All right. Good afternoon, distinguished guests and colleagues. My name is Jane Sanchez. I'm Deputy Librarian for Library Collections and Services and the 25th Law Librarian of Congress. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. Today it has to be virtual, but welcome nonetheless. Thank you for joining the Law Library's 2020 commemoration of Constitution Day. Constitution Day, officially known as Constitution Day and Citizenship Day, is a federal holiday observed each year to commemorate the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787, and to recognize all who, by coming of age by naturalization, have become citizens. Senator Robert C. Byrd of West Virginia included key provisions in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2005, designating September 17th as Constitution Day and Citizenship Day. The act also added the requirement that public schools and government offices should provide educational programs to promote a better understanding of the Constitution. As a result, the Law Library of Congress annually hosts a Constitution Day program to highlight the Constitution and the freedoms it grants all Americans. Although it was signed 233 years ago, it is the longest surviving charter of government that inspired democratic ideals and principles of freedom throughout the world. Before we start, I would like to just briefly mention that the Law Library's Legal Research Institute website is available to learn about new events, and you can go to loc.gov/law/learning. Do not forget to follow the Law Library on Twitter and Facebook, and subscribe to our email alerts at loc.gov/subscribe so you can keep up with our news and events. We also hope you will visit the Law Library's virtual booth at this year's National Book Festival, which this year is going to span 3 days, from September 25th to September 27th. And now I am so pleased to invite our speaker, Mr. Michael J. Murphy. Mr. Murphy is a historical publication specialist in the Office of the Historian of the U.S. House of Representatives. Today he will be talking to us about the Bulwark of Freedom, African American members of Congress, the Constitution during Reconstruction. Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us in this virtual celebration of Constitution Day, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you to the Law Librarian of Congress for the invitation to speak today and for the introduction. And thank you to Robert Bremer for the behind-the-scenes work to put this event together. So my name is Michael Murphy, and I work in the Office of the Historian. Our office conducts research and produces publications on the history of the House. We are available to answer questions from members of Congress as well as the general public. And we invite you to look at the resources on our website, history.house.gov, where you can find publications like one of our ebooks, Black Americans in Congress, recently produced and updated, seen here, as well as a large collection of oral histories and other resources. This year, 2020, is the 150th anniversary of the election of Joseph Rainey, who's on the cover of that book. He was the first African-American member of the U.S. House of Representatives. The Office of the Historian has used this opportunity to produce a booklet on his life and career. We recently published this, and it'll be up on our website shortly as a PDF for the public to download. Rainey was sworn into office on December 12, 1870, and this was a significant moment in the history of the House. The event was covered by the press across the nation. Born enslaved, Rainey had worked as a barber in Charleston, South Carolina before the war. In the House, he served until 1879, becoming the longest-serving member black member of the House until the 1950s. In 1874, he even presided over the House of Representatives, becoming the first African-American member to do so. This was also a celebrated story across the country. The New York Herald's headline announced, quote, "A liberated slave in the speaker's chair." And another reporter commented, quote, "Surely the world moves, for who would have dreamed it 20 years ago?" While 20 years earlier, many had dreamed of emancipation and citizenship and access to public office. Many had imagined a day when African Americans could hold seats in Congress and other public offices at the federal, state, and local level. But what had changed by 1870 that enabled Rainey to build this political career? What made this possible? Rainey was elected to Congress during Reconstruction, a period of intense social and political change following the Civil War, basically from 1865 to 1877. In the late 1860s, the Constitution itself was amended in many ways that guaranteed fundamental rights to African Americans. And at the same time, the black community across the nation seized the opportunity for political participation. In some ways, however, the Constitution was also a constant in this equation. The avenue for Rainey to win a seat in the House was in Article 1, which states that members of the House shall be, quote, "chosen every second year by the people of the states, directly elected by the people of their district." So for our purposes today on Constitution Day, I wanted to reflect on the careers of some of the African American members of Congress during Reconstruction and the way that these individuals embraced the Constitution as a tool to redefine American democracy. Black members looked to the Constitution as the means to justify their claims to equal standing as citizens of the United States and fought against those who wanted to limit the effectiveness of the Reconstruction Amendments, the amendments that were passed following the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These were significant amendments and the first for over 60 years to the Constitution. Prior to the war, the Constitution itself had provided the basis for exclusion, along with the court interpretations like the Dred Scott case in 1857, in which the Supreme Court majority ruled that those of African descent were never included in the notion of citizens inscribed in the Constitution. The court said this was not the intention of the founders, and therefore Dred Scott, a slave who was sued for his freedom when he was brought into a free state, had no standing in court. So the Constitution was used in this case in a roundabout way to deny the personhood of those of African descent. Following the war, Congress began to rectify this issue for the 4 million freed people after the destruction of slavery. In the Reconstruction Amendments, Congress tried to establish the legal status and civil and political rights of African Americans. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment established citizenship for all persons born or naturalized in the United States, birthright citizenship, and guaranteed equal protection under the law for all. The 15th Amendment, shown here when it was drafted in the House, declared that the right to vote shall not be, quote, "shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." In addition, during these 5 years, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts and set the required terms for states to regain representation in Congress. They had to ratify the 14th Amendment, approve new state constitutions, protect the voting rights of African American men. So by 1868, politics in the South, especially the former Confederate states, had been transformed. Black voters went to the polls, new state constitutions were written, and many state and local governments were controlled by the Republican Party in the South by the end of the decade, by 1870. In all, during Reconstruction, more than 2,000 African American state and local officials were elected before the end of this period. At the national level, there were not as many electoral victories, but they were the few that were made were extremely significant. On Capitol Hill, Congress received its first African-American member in 1870. It wasn't Rainey, it was actually Hiram Revels of Mississippi, who took his seat in the U.S. Senate in February of 1870. Revels, however, was appointed by the state legislature, as were all U.S. senators prior to 1913, the passage of the 17th Amendment. Later that year, Rainey became the first African-American directly elected to Congress. He joined the House in December, and he was the first of 14 black members. We could go back 2 slides. That's fine, thanks. And he was the first of 14 black members who were elected to the House between 1870 and 1877. They were all from southern states. The most came from South Carolina. All were Republicans, and it was difficult for them to lead the legislative agenda of their party in the House. They could use their time on the floor to intervene in legislative debates. They also served on committees. Many participated in committee hearings. They had the rights and privileges of members on the floor, but they also had varied experiences during their time in office in terms of what they could accomplish. They also had a range of backgrounds before they arrived on Capitol Hill. Their personal stories, personal histories shaped their political careers. Some were formerly enslaved, others were born free, or they were emancipated before the Civil War. Robert Smalls of South Carolina, for instance, shown here, he was enslaved in Charleston, South Carolina before the Civil War, and living in an urban area like Charleston, he was forced to work on ships and he was in control of a ship in Charleston Harbor during the war that eventually, at an opportune moment, he commandeered that ship, brought his family and other enslaved people onto the ship, and sailed it out of the harbor to the Union Navy in a celebrated event that made him kind of a national celebrity. He subsequently joined the Union Navy for the duration of the war. He returned to South Carolina after the war and became involved in state politics. He elected seats in the state House of Representatives, and the state Senate before serving parts of 5 non-consecutive terms in Congress. The first he began his service in 1875. Robert B. Elliott was educated in England and trained as a lawyer. Elliott moved to South Carolina after the war and worked for a newspaper before being elected to the state legislature. He was elected in the 42nd Congress. You can advance the slides. And served until he resigned due to Thank you. Until he resigned to return to state politics. He rejoined the state House in South Carolina, where he became Speaker of the House. He was well known for his speeches on the floor, and the 2 of them are very relevant to our discussion today. Alonzo Ranzier of South Carolina was born free and served in the state House before he was elected the first black lieutenant governor of South Carolina. He served 1 term in the 43rd Congress. He was at the center. This placed him at the center of the debate over civil rights legislation from 1873 to 1875. Other black members we'll talk about today: James Rapier of Alabama was born free, but he went to Canada and he was educated there before returning to the United States after the war, and he entered politics in Alabama. He was a member of the State Constitutional Convention, one of those conventions that reformed the state governments following the end of the Civil War and the collapse of the Confederacy, and he was elected to a term in office and joined the House in 1873. Also, Josiah Walls of Florida. He was born enslaved in Virginia. He was elected 3 times to the House. He was also nearly assassinated on the campaign trail. He was removed from Congress twice after his opponents contested the results of the elections in Florida. He was one of 7 African-American members who faced these contested elections proceedings in the House during Reconstruction. Finally, we'll get to Rainey himself. Rainey's path to Congress was unique. He was born enslaved in Georgetown, South Carolina, which is a town north of Charleston, where he was eventually emancipated by his father. His father was a barber, was allowed to keep a portion of the earnings from his labor while enslaved, eventually bought his own freedom and purchased the freedom of his family. The family eventually made its way to Charleston, where Rainey worked in the Mills House Hotel. Prior to the war, he was plying his trade as a barber. But once the war broke out in South Carolina, he was forced by the Confederates to work on building fortifications for the city of Charleston in the harbor, and he eventually worked on blockade runners, ships that traveled to Nassau in the Bahamas and eventually Bermuda to engage in illicit trade and try to bypass the Union blockade of the southern states. That gave him access to an escape route, and Rainey and his wife were able to escape from South Carolina, travel to Bermuda, where they set up thriving businesses for the duration of the war. He lived in Bermuda until 1866 and worked as a barber, made money, but also stayed in constant touch with what was going on in the United States and the progress of the war. And when the war was over, he returned to Charleston and went back into business in South Carolina. But he also thought immediately about his options for engaging in political activities. He became part of the Republican Party in South Carolina. He was in the local Republican committee in his town when he moved back to Georgetown, and became a member of the State Constitutional Convention, where he helped draft the new state constitution for South Carolina in 1868. Following the creation of the state constitution, he was elected state senator in 1868, where he eventually chaired the finance committee in the state senate. So he was enmeshed in the state politics. He also looked at the possibility of running for a seat in the House in 1868, and his opportunity emerged in 1870 when the sitting member was forced to resign. When that member resigned, Rainey ran for the opening, and he was nominated by his party and won election in the fall of 1870 to the remainder of the term, as that member resigned, and to the next term, the 42nd Congress. He was eventually elected to 4 full terms and that part of the remainder of that term before he left office in 1879. Rainey's legislative agenda during office was very interesting. He tried to get national funding for an education system, a national education system that would be not a desegregated national education system, and tried to advocate for public funds for that. He also tried to pass a bill to provide federal oversight to ensure fair elections, and he defended the rights of workers, immigrants, and Native Americans. But what we'll talk about today is several of the instances during his time in office when he called for the federal government to intervene to protect the rights of the freed people and the larger black population in the South especially. Rainey often talked about these issues in the framework of what he called human rights, and called for legislation that would eliminate distinctions between different groups in the eyes of the law. And he was committed to using his seat in the House to further this agenda, and spoke out frequently during debates on legislation related to these issues. As an orator, he was well known for his skills. He was not formally educated, but like many of the black members in Congress, he was self-educated, but he had read widely and really went out of his way to include subtle and explicit literary and religious imagery in his speeches. For example, from passages from the Bible, from English poets such as Lord Byron, and nearly every major speech he made on the House floor included a reference from one of Shakespeare's great works. He frequently drew inspiration from Hamlet, Othello, and Julius Caesar. And Rainey's first extended intervention in a debate was for the bill that would become what was known as the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. This was one of several laws known as enforcement acts, and the Klan Act gave the federal government extraordinary powers to ensure equal protection of the law, expand the reach of federal law enforcement, and empower the federal government to aggressively prosecute the Ku Klux Klan and other white vigilante groups that were engaging in a campaign of terror against the black community in states like South Carolina. Congress also, through this law, gave the president the power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and use federal troops to directly intervene to quell the violence in the South. So during the debate over the Klan Act, Rainey joined his South Carolina colleague, Robert Elliott, in laying out their rationale for defending the bill on moral, political, and constitutional grounds. For many of the Democratic opponents of this bill, the proposed legislation was controversial and indeed unconstitutional in their eyes. They asked, what right did the federal government have to intervene in affairs within a state? Democrats made the case that this was a, quote, states' rights matter on the floor of the House, making it clear that the proposed bill crossed the constitutional line, separating the powers of the federal government and state governments. Republican legislators, both white and black, objected to these claims from a number of angles. But of the black members in the House, Elliott and Rainey made the most forceful rebuttals. Elliott directly challenged those who said the bill was unconstitutional. That was really the gist of his speech on April 1st, 1871. He addressed the argument of Democratic Representative and future Speaker of the House, Michael Kerr of Indiana, who had referred to Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution to argue against the Klan Act. This section states, quote, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. Kerr's argument emphasized that the federal government should only intervene in the internal affairs of a state when requested by the state in question. For Elliott, the reference to domestic violence was not contingent on an invitation. He said the clause is not inhibitory, but mandatory. He said it was designed to, quote, enlarge the duties of the government, not restrict them. To make this case, he even cited the preamble to the Constitution and said one of the great objects of this document was quote, securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The federal government must not be what he called a passive observer, and allow the violation of these individual rights. Elliott criticized Kerr for not emphasizing the opening sentence of that section of the Constitution. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. Elliott called this a, quote, duty imposed without a condition precedent. For Elliott, the mandate is absolute, he said, and the Constitution, quote, vests in the federal government the right to act whenever any state's republican form of government was threatened by either invasion or domestic violence. Essentially, Elliott was trying to define the responsibilities of the federal government and the rights guaranteed to citizens. What was happening in the South, according to Elliott, was indeed domestic violence and could not be understood any other way. Those engaged in the violent attacks on African Americans in the South were committed, Elliott said, to, quote, defeat the ballot with the bullet or other coercive means, and were engaged in acts of organized lawlessness, he said. And he called for the United States to protect those citizens in the South, many of whom, he said, had stood behind the Union, the North, in the Civil War. And he warned that if they refused to do so, if the federal government refused to do so, he said, quote, your free Constitution is a mockery and a snare. Rainey weighed in later that evening. He acknowledged Elliott's arguments previously as to the constitutional questions surrounding the bill, but he also made a moral argument for this legislation and made a plea to his colleagues to think about the purpose of the Constitution. For Rainey, the Constitution should be the bulwark of freedom, protecting, quote, inalienable rights for all against those issues, those same threats, foreign invasion and domestic violence. Again, he was using the language of the Constitution in his argument. For Rainey, this was an essential function of any system of government, and he expressed his outrage to his House colleagues when he said, "Tell me nothing of a Constitution which fails to shelter beneath its rightful power the people of a country." And Rainey went on to further define the people, describing an inclusive vision that connected citizens to the Constitution itself. This founding document, Rainey said, was designed to provide, quote, protection to the humblest citizen without regard to rank, creed, or color. For Rainey, reducing the debate over the bill to questions of constitutional law overlooked the notion of equal protection inscribed in the 14th Amendment, as well as ignoring the plight of the victims of this violence in the South. He embraced the Constitution as a document that codified fairness, justice, and equality, and considered it fundamental to understanding the nation's purpose and history. He even added that throughout its history, the United States had been, quote, proudly proclaimed to be the world, the refuge, the safe asylum of the oppressed of all lands. If Congress refused to act in defense of the rights of citizens, he asked, quote, was this grand boast of ours a mere form of words, an utter fraud? So in this case, for the first time, African-American representatives in the House were in the position to advocate for federal legislation that protected the rights of African-American citizens. Both Elliott and Rainey used the Constitution to make the case for federal action. And in this case, they were successful. They and their Republican colleagues were successful. The Republican majority at the time passed the bill, and the powers of the Klan Act were actually used in South Carolina in October of that year, 1871, to break up this organization and momentarily quell the violence in several counties in that state. Another significant piece of legislation passed during the Reconstruction was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This was a bill that took more than 4 years to become law, starting a half-decade earlier when Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts introduced a new civil rights bill in the Senate. There had been a civil rights bill in 1866. The constitutional amendments talked about civil rights guarantees, and many Republicans, Sumner chief among them, talked about the need for new legislation to provide enforcement mechanisms to protect these rights. So eventually, this bill was passed into law in 1875. Sumner died in March of 1874. But throughout these 5 years, African-American members tried to expand and strengthen the bill's scope and effectiveness as it was in debate, while also using their time on the floor to make it clear that this proposed law would affect them directly. They had personal stake in the passage of this legislation, and they felt that their experiences needed to be conveyed to their colleagues on the House floor, who definitely did not have these same experiences. In January of 1874, a series of exchanges between Democratic opponents of the bill and Republican proponents of the bill demonstrated the way the Constitution became central to this debate. We can start with the opponents of the bill. For example, John Harris of Virginia was a Democrat. He called the bill unconstitutional and said it would lead to, quote, the downfall of our government. He described the bill as expanding the power of the federal government to regulate interpersonal relations, which he said it had no grounds to do, and warned that many crises would occur in Southern society should it be passed. In his speech, Harris also called the Constitution the Bulwark of Freedom, but he had a very different vision of freedom than someone like Rainey, who used the same phrase. For Harris, the Constitution served as the defensive wall protecting a system of limited government that, if overrun, would unleash the federal government to wreak havoc upon the will of the people as expressed in their state governments. A similar argument was made by Representative Alexander Stephens of Georgia, who followed Harris and gave a lengthy denunciation of the proposed Civil Rights Bill. Stephens, if you remember, had been vice president of the Confederacy. He had served in the House before the war, and he returned to the House in 1873 after a 14-year absence. His hour-long speech portrayed any vote on this bill as a pivotal moment in the battle between what he called constitutionalism and centralism. And he posited that any interference by the federal government would be against the very, he said, against the very genius and entire spirit of our whole system. And for Stephens, quote, the germinal and seminal principle of American constitutional liberty is the absolute unrestricted right of state self-government, especially in internal affairs. This was constitutionalism for Stephens, while accusation of centralism and centralization, another word that was frequently used in these debates, was often levied, those terms were often levied against Republicans who urged federal action to protect civil rights in the South. The federal Constitution, Stephens says, he praised it as a matchless and majestic structure. Created in 1787, and the Reconstruction amendments for Stephens were, in fact, consistent rather than revolutionary. He cited an 1873 Supreme Court decision in his speech that had interpreted the 14th Amendment in such a way as to limit federal jurisdiction over the states. So, in Stephens' framework, this was these new amendments of the Reconstruction era had built on a framework that already existed and could still be understood through his version of constitutionalism. Over the next 2 days, African American members confronted Stephens' arguments with their own interpretation of the significance of the Constitution, and they added their personal experiences to make the case for the bill's passage. Alonzo Rainzier followed Stephens on the floor. He called for the bill to pass because its purpose was to guarantee, quote, equal opportunities and equal protection. And he identified the Reconstruction Amendments as establishing the basis for this equality in the United States. He said, quote, in very many, if not all of the states of the Union, there is no practical freedom for African Americans, nor would there be any worth talking about it left, nor would there be anything worth talking about if left to the states to regulate, he added. This new legislation, Rainzier said, was absolutely needed to secure what he called practical freedom for all Americans. The following day, Josiah Walls took to the floor to question those who opposed the Civil Rights Bill. Again, he pointed to the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and he also made clear that he emphasized those words in the clause, the Equal Protection Clause, and the 14th Amendment, that, quote, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And this was a frequent refrain of African American members during these debates. They often referred to their, quote, privileges and immunities as citizens under the Constitution. And this extended beyond the halls of Congress as constitutional language became really a common component of African American political discourse throughout Reconstruction. So for Walls, this was a clear statement of the restrictions on state governments and the need to guarantee equal protection. When the provision for equal protection of the laws is violated, Walls said, legislation was needed for enforcement, and the 14th Amendment made this possible. The next day, Robert Elliott once again addressed the floor, and he addressed Stephens directly in a speech that was really celebrated in the press. Elliott rejected Stephens' claims that it was beyond the powers of Congress to pass legislation that pertained to individual rights in the states. He described his idea of the role of government in protecting individual rights. He said, quote, the Constitution of a free government ought always be construed in favor of human rights. And the Reconstruction Amendments, he added, made these rights part of the Constitution. Elliott emphasized that those amendments, quote, in positive words, invest Congress with the power to protect the citizen in his civil and political rights. He also disputed claims by the bill's opponents that there were distinctions between the rights protected by the Constitution and the laws of an individual state. He said this was irrelevant as, quote, all discrimination, all denial of equality before the law, all denial of the equal protection of the laws, whether state or national laws, is forbidden by the 14th Amendment. Those were Eliot's words. Several months later, James Rapier used Stevens as an example of those pushing this restrictive view of the Constitution and tried to emphasize the need for action by calling, or really emphasizing the pace of change and the degree of change that had occurred in the Constitution, in the legislature, and the need for action in 1874. Rapier compared Stevens to Washington Irving's fictional character Rip Van Winkle, who seemed to have been asleep for 20 years, only to wake with antiquated ideas calcified in the distant past. That's how he described Stevens. Stevens and his fellow Southern Democrats, Rapier said, "We're not prepared to adjust to the, quote, new order of things, and we're poorly qualified to teach this nation the meaning of our amended Constitution." So Rapier understood the Constitution as a document that could be continually perfected, and legislation could bolster that quest for a more perfect union. Rapier disputed the notion that these rights could not be selectively granted to some and not all in the United States. How could he be a member of the House of Representatives and not enjoy equal protection of the law beyond the House chamber? He was adamant that there could be no ambiguity, adding, quote, either I am a man or am I not a man. If one, I am entitled to all the rights, privileges, and immunities common to any other class in this country. If not a man, I have no right to vote, no right to a seat here in the House. And this was at the heart of Rapier's argument, a very personal argument. He also made the case against those who called racial discrimination merely a matter of public opinion, those who said this could change gradually over time. This was an argument made by the opponents of the bill frequently, who feared this civil rights legislation would force interracial interactions in the South, personal relationships, and other associations, as they termed it, which were contrary to white Southerners' ideas about race. And for Rapier, this was inconsequential to the law. It was a matter of personal preference, yes, he acknowledged, but personal prejudices could remain so long as he and others of African descent, he said, had equal access to civil and political rights as citizens. Without the Reconstruction Acts and constitutional amendments, which made real these changes, he asked, quote, when would public opinion in the South have suggested the propriety of giving me the ballot? And he ended by saying that this idea, which he heard often and rejected, that African Americans, quote, have now every right under the common law, he rejected that notion. Instead, he said, quote, the only law that we have any regard for is uncommon law of the most positive character. Finally, we can return to Joseph Rainey, who brought many of these ideas together in February of 1875. He talked in this speech calling for the passage of the Civil Rights Act about the need for the protection of the privileges and immunities of African Americans in the United States. He used that language once again, and he brought concerns about segregated public spaces to the House floor. He talked about entering streetcars in Richmond, Virginia, and being told to go into a segregated car. And many of his black colleagues in the House raised similar issues on the floor to talk about their personal encounters with this emerging system of segregation, which would not really be solidified until the 1890s, but was beginning to be implemented across the South. And these members in their travels back and forth from Washington, D.C., were seeing the consequences of these changes in their daily lives. Rainey noted that the Democratic opponents of the bill read the Constitution, quote, with partial and selfish motives. He said African Americans, the freed people, all in this nation were part of the larger body politic and were thus afforded rights by the entire document. The Civil Rights Bill was necessary to ensure the enjoyment of these rights. Quote, the only ground upon which these privileges and immunities are withheld, Rainey said, is because of complexional differences. Ultimately, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 passed before the end of Congress. It was kind of rushed through, and some of the provisions that would have guaranteed equal access to public education were stripped from the bill. It did include provisions that prohibited discrimination in juries, in public transportation, and public accommodations. But over time, Supreme Court decisions severely limited its impact. In the mid-1870s, many of these African American members believed that this legislation, coupled with the amendments, would make some of these changes more concrete. Eliot in 1874 had said that, quote, equality before the law is now the broad, universal, glorious rule and mandate of the Republic. No state can violate it, he said. He was confident that, quote, if Congress shall do its duty and pass the Civil Rights Act, this mandate would be only strengthened. But the end of Reconstruction produced a different outcome, as the Civil Rights Act was largely stripped of its power by a Supreme Court decision in 1883. And by the 1890s, Southern states were able to create the system of Jim Crow segregation through state and local laws and the use of extra-legal violence that created the system of discrimination that affected the economic and political prospects of African Americans throughout the region and reinforced this system throughout all of the United States. This also directly shaped the history of the House of Representatives, as few black members remained in the House by the 1890s. There were no African American members elected in the 20th century until 1928, and no black members won election to the House from a southern state until 1972. In effect, the Bulwark of Freedom, as Rainey called it, cracked when subjected to the onslaught of court decisions, state and local laws, and extra-legal violence in the decades following Reconstruction. Despite racial discrimination and segregation, new legislation and legal interpretations in the courts still had the potential to fortify and reinvigorate the defenses afforded by the Constitution and its amendments. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s embraced this vision nearly 100 years later to produce transformative change. This founding document remained available to all who looked to it as a framework for understanding individual rights and the relationship between individuals and government. Joseph Rainey described this connection as he called for the enactment of the Civil Rights Bill in 1873. Denouncing those who were committed to racial discrimination, he called for Congress to act. He said, quote, "We are determined to fight this question. We believe the Constitution gives us this right. All of the 15 amendments to the Constitution run down in one single line of protecting the rights of the citizens of this country. And now we say to you that if you will not obey the Constitution, then the power is given by the Constitution for the enactment of such a law to enforce the provisions thereof." Here, Rainey describes the Constitution as both a defensive bulwark, shielding individual freedoms, as well as an offensive tool, enabling Congress to make legislation to guarantee those rights. For Rainey and his colleagues in the House in the 1870s, the Constitution provided both the inspiration and the legal foundation for their quest to realize the promise of American democracy and experience what his colleague Alonzo Ranzier had called practical freedom. And again, thank you for inviting me to speak today, and I look forward to seeing your questions, any questions you might have for me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I added the questions into the chat and sent them to you. Can you see them?
Under chat with all panelists, yeah. Okay. Okay, question from Thomas. Question from the audience. Thank you, Thomas, for your question. Could you address? He says, could you address the careers of the members of Congress after their service, and even the role that their descendants played? it's an interesting question. Many of these members had interesting careers after they left the House. Some remained in politics, like you saw Elliott return to the state House, but only for a few years. He actually died very young in 1874 or so, around that time. Rainey went on to a very interesting career from 1879 until his death in 1887. He was almost appointed clerk of the House, which is really the head of the institution, who administers the functions of that chamber in Congress. The clerk of the House was a position appointed mainly by the majority party always by the majority party, but it was very much tied to the leadership in Congress in 1879. Rainey was considered, but in 1879 the Republicans were not the majority, and he was not named clerk of the House. He also tried to secure that appointment in 1881. He did receive an appointment as a Treasury agent in South Carolina, working for the Department of Treasury for a couple of years. Then he engaged in business in New York City, Washington, D.C., a number of business ventures. One was a coal and wood company in Washington, D.C. But throughout the 1880s, before his death in 1887, he was also engaged in political activism, spoke at many commemorative events, anniversaries in Washington, D.C. He was really firmly engaged in politics for the next few years. Others, like Smalls, continued to try to serve in Congress, engaged in South Carolina politics, and think that many of these individuals had more difficult times following the end of Reconstruction, when their political rights were severely restricted in the 1880s, 90s, and beyond. Let me see these other questions coming in for a moment. Okay. So after Reconstruction, when were the next African Americans elected to the House and Senate? That's an interesting question. It gives you a nice chance for us to look at some perspective here. The end of Reconstruction in 1877, there were 5 or 6 more members elected, and some of the members that I mentioned who were elected during Reconstruction were elected to additional terms in the 1880s. But by 1901, the last black member of Congress left the House until 1928. The member elected in 1928 was Oscar DePriest of Chicago. He represented Chicago, Illinois in the House. And he was the first black member elected from a northern state. And he represents the transformation, the demographic transformation of the country after the Great Migration. And so he was the first in the House, but the numbers of members in the House remained below 10. Black members in the House remained below 10 until the end of the 1960s, I believe. In the Senate, there were 2 black senators who served during Reconstruction, Revels and Blanche Bruce of Mississippi. But when Bruce left the Senate at the end of his term in 1881, I believe that was, there were no African-American senators until 1967, when Edward Brooke was elected from Massachusetts. And still there's a significantly smaller number of African-American members in the Senate over time than over the entire history of the Senate than the House. Another question: how many Northern African Americans served in Congress during this era? Whoever posed this question added their comment that they guessed 0, and you're correct. There were no African Americans serving from the North during Reconstruction or any time in the 19th century or 20th century until 1929. And this is because of that demographic distribution. And many of these districts, like several of the South Carolina districts that Smalls, Rainey, Elliott, Rainsier, and other South Carolina representatives represented, they were, some of them were black majority districts. And when African American voting rights were protected, they were able to elect their representatives to Congress. Just looking through these questions quickly. Are there any memorials in the House to Joseph Rainey or to any others who fought for these rights? There will be an exhibit in the Capitol. Whenever we can return to the Capitol, it will be an exhibit put up by the Office of Art and Archives that will be able to be a visual engagement with Joseph Rainey's career that I highly recommend. Rainey's portrait is displayed in the Capitol, and there are other statues and memorials that pay tribute to individuals who fought for civil rights over the long history of the United States, including a bust of Martin Luther King and a statue of Rosa Parks in Statuary Hall. Other questions? Was the 1875 Civil Rights Act similar to the 1964 Civil Rights Act? That's an interesting question to connect these two periods. And I think a lot of the intentions a lot of the text of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, you would recognize in the 1964 Act, talking about ending discrimination in public spaces, public accommodations, public transportation, and they're remarkably similar in that way. What had changed is the ability for enforcement. The 1964 Civil Rights Act contains more provisions that were designed to enforce that act, and the Supreme Court decisions that enabled changes such as the desegregation of the South and the willingness of the political majority in the United States to enact those changes. So we can see similarities in legislation, but in every case, I think it's important to understand the historical context and how those pieces of legislation were put into action. And I don't know how we're doing on time, Robert, but that's up to you in terms of if I should go on.
I think we've got time for two more questions if you're, yeah, that's good with you.
Okay. So one more question here, when did Jim Crow laws start to deprive newly gained rights, start to deprive African Americans of these newly gained rights? So Jim Crow as a system, I think we can, the Jim Crow that you may understand from popular histories and more academic studies, we would understand that being implemented and solidified by the end of the 1890s. These were the state and local laws, along with that extra legal violence like public lynchings that restricted these rights. Remember, the constitutional amendments were, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments were not removed from the Constitution. They still existed, but in practice, Jim Crow in the South stripped African Americans of those rights. And I would say by the 1890s, but this process began even as Rainey and his colleagues were serving in the House. They talked about segregation on public transportation. They talked about, Rainey told a story about being charged more for a beer at a Washington, D.C. Establishment in a way of forcing him not to patronize that establishment. He also talked about being rejected from hotels in his travels and forced into certain class of transportation on boats and train travel. So this, what we might associate with Jim Crow started early, but the full system of Jim Crow being implemented and being extremely difficult to circumvent, I would date that to the 1890s and beyond. Another question, seeking clarification about Article 4 of the Section 4. And just go to that section. So what does application of the legislature amount to? That's the question. This section of the Constitution talked about, this was in the debate over whether or not the federal government could intervene. Michael Kerr of Indiana used this to say that the Klan Act was not constitutional because the United States, he said, or he quoted the portion of the Constitution that talked about the Constitution shall, or the United States shall protect states against invasion and on application of the legislature or the executive, or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So that's talking about the legislature and the executive of the state. And Kerr said that this meant that if the governor or the state legislature didn't request federal intervention, the federal government had no business intervening in a state matter. So that was the argument of Kerr against the bill. Elliott said this is not restrictive. In fact, you can read that any way you like. The fact that the government had to protect citizens equally meant that they must intervene. They cannot be what he called a passive observer. So there's two interpretations there of this section of the Constitution.
Hi, I'm Jean Dennis, and I'm the Acting Assistant Director for the American Law Division of the Congressional Research Service. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Law Library, the Center for Learning, Literacy, and Engagement, and the Office of the Historian for the House of Representatives for putting this Constitution Day program together. I want to thank Michael for his terrific presentation. That was very informative and a great way to celebrate the Constitution. Finally, to wrap up today's events, I would like to share with you the library's online Constitution Annotated, constitution.congress.gov, which is celebrating its first anniversary today. For those of you not familiar with the Constitution Annotated, this Senate document has served as Congress's official record of the Constitution for over 100 years. It provides Congress and the public an explanation of every provision of the Constitution and how the Supreme Court's interpretations of those provisions have evolved. Since its launch a year ago, the online Constitution Annotated has had over 1 million visits and millions of page views, educating people across the nation and around the world on the Constitution. Recognizing the importance of a reliable source of information on the Constitution, one free from political bias, Congress mandated that the Librarian of Congress prepare the Constitution Annotated. The librarian in turn delegated this task to the Congressional Research Service. Written in plain English by attorneys in CRS's American Law Division, the Constitution Annotated conforms to CRS's standards of objective, authoritative, timely, and nonpartisan analysis that inform all CRS advice to Congress. To make the Constitution readily accessible to those without legal training, the Constitution Annotated details the historical context surrounding Supreme Court precedents and explains the various approaches that Supreme Court justices have used when ruling on constitutional questions. Continually updated, the Constitution Annotated provides an analysis of the Constitution to assist Congress and the public in understanding America's legal foundation. While the Constitution Annotated was first conceived in the 19th century, the new website brings this resource fully into the 21st century. Featuring advanced search tools and a modern user-friendly interface, the website makes the 3,000 pages of the Constitution Annotated fully searchable and accessible to online audiences. Since its launch, the library has further honed the website, adding new features such as a homepage carousel that highlights key issues, an updates page to announce recent changes to the content, improved search functionality, and streamlined browse navigation. The Constitution Annotated also features discussions of emerging law issues, Library of Congress resources for researching the Constitution, and supplemental researches such as the Table of Supreme Court Justices, the Table of Supreme Court Decisions overruled by subsequent decisions, and the Table of Laws the Supreme Court has held unconstitutional in whole or in part. Please celebrate Constitution Day by exploring the Constitution annotated and sharing it with your friends and colleagues. And thank you so very much for joining us today to celebrate the Constitution.